Hello, this is Art Fictions. I'm artist Jillian Knipe, and welcome to the second episode of this special culture exchange series in conjunction with the British Council's international season. Today we meet Nigerian-born, London-based artist Richard Ayodeji Ikhide, whose work and selected novel by Amos Tutuola explores customs and mythologies, negotiating around symbols, objects and ghosts. Or perhaps more accurately, in Richard's drawings and paintings, a rich heritage of ancestors whose insights, perspectives and experience play a major role in shaping his present. So while Richard holds his African heritage close to his heart, he admits that his discoveries gained by living in the UK are slowly but surely seeping into his work, challenging his own sense of cultural identity and complicating the account of histories he learnt as a boy. To see his work, check out Richard's Instagram, Pandagwad, spelt Pandagwad, as well as the podcast notes, which list his current and upcoming exhibitions, his reading and artistic interests. Let's hear him jumpstart our conversation with a fantastic glimpse of his paternal lineage as we enter the mysterious bush of ghosts. You know what I'm going to start with? I had to do a little bit of research on how to say your name.
Okay, Ayodeji Ikhide.
Where do the names come from?
So Ayodeji is my middle name.
Oh, okay.
It's given to me by my mum. And Ikhide is our family name, but it's not our family name because my granddad got adopted by someone and got sent to maritime school in Essex or something like that in like 1930 something as a way to kind of like honour this person. He ended up taking the Ikhide name. Yeah, because my granddad's dad was a chief.
Yeah, I read that somewhere.
Then he got trained up. You know, it's like colonial times. You'd have somebody send you to England. So he ended up going into like the shipping business. And yeah, he's had a very interesting history as well. And then, yeah, came back to Nigeria, set up his businesses and got into politics. It's all crazy. Married 2 wives, 12 kids. Like,
yeah. This is one of
crazy.
many relations, I understand. Anyway, we should probably start in some sort of formal way. So, Richard Ayodeji Ikhide.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right. Yeah. Welcome to Art Fictions. You've chosen My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. Thank you very much. I like my cover actually better than your one, but you got 2 books for one. So.
Yeah.
Well, that's his previous book, isn't it?
Yeah, The Palm Wine Drinkers. I actually haven't read that.
Yeah, it's really well reviewed. Anyway, so it's written by Amos Tutuola in 1954, and it begins with a young boy's claim of not understanding bad from good. Along with his older brother, he separated from his mother before she can teach him the difference between the two. So this is how he comes to mistakenly enter the bush of ghosts after he is separated from his brother who's captured by slavers. It is written that the bush of ghosts is so dreadful that no superior earthly person ever entered it. It is on the second side of the world between the heaven and earth and is strictly banned to every earthly person, but due to the boy's ignorance of bad and good, as I said before, he's allowed to stay. So from age 7 to 31, he encounters gold, silver and copper ghosts, a devil reverend and his devil worshippers, a smelling ghost, homeless ghost, river ghosts, armless ghosts, and burglar ghosts who steal the place of women's babies. All the while he shapeshifts into different animals, losing and regaining his sight, marrying and leaving his wives. He finds his way back to the beginning where he first entered the bush of ghosts, only to be captured by slave traders. The master turns out to be his brother, so he is freed. So tell me why, Richard, you chose this book. I mean, you were going to choose a graphic novel first, weren't you?
Yeah, I was going to choose a graphic novel, but the graphic novel I would have chosen would have been too big because it would have been this graphic novel by Alejandro Jodorowsky and Juan Jimenez called Meta Barons. It's about this massive space epic that spans generations. So you have this kind of lineage of these kind of space warriors story is. Each section of the book kind of goes along and follows each member of this particular lineage. So it's a really interesting in terms of like generational history and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm not surprised you'd be attracted to a book like that, but too many pages, right?
Yeah, too many pages, and obviously I don't want to put you through that.
I don't want to go through that either.
But yeah, I think my Life in the Bush of Ghosts, similar kind of ideas, and for me it's touching more upon this kind of like hero's journey, or this young child in this unknown landscape and having to navigate all these different facets of it, and they become almost kind of metaphorical, allegorical. Yeah, so it's been a really interesting book for me that I keep kind of going back to. I'm kind of rereading it again because it's something I feel like every time you read it, it changes, because of how almost abstract the world is, this bush of ghosts that he goes into. You can almost kind of form new meanings from things each time you read it. The first time I read it, I was more interested in the kind of fantastical kind of like non-physical aspect of it, of how these kind of world of the ghosts operated. But then now I'm reading it again and him kind of using these more contemporary colonial ideas, like with the church and law system. So I'm reading it with a slightly different viewpoint now in terms of, okay, this is somebody who's about to be captured and be sent into slavery and then ends up being captured at the end again. So yeah, and then he also goes through these different stages of being subjugated by these different ghosts in various forms, either being turned into an animal. So in some ways, they can also become metaphors for slavery in a sense of how these different ghosts subjugate him in different ways. It's interesting how it has so many ways you can kind of view the story. Also on a kind of psychological level of how he's maybe repurposing some of these more mythological ideas or folktale ideas and bringing them into a more kind of contemporary sense. Because we're thinking Nigeria 1954. My dad was born in 56. Nigeria gets its independence in 1960. So, this is like peak colonial period. And I can imagine that in 1954, that would have been around the time where Nigerians are starting to organize themselves and request for independence from the British. So it was written at quite an interesting time, actually.
And probably quite shocking. Just coming back to this idea of the superhero, it is like he's abandoned, essentially. He's separated from his mother, he's separated from his family, he's separated from customs and from really knowing and learning through his mother about what is good and what is bad. And so he goes into, let's call it some sort of purgatory, and he has to learn from his instincts, how to decide between people. And straight away, he escapes the slavers only to face these gold, silver, copper ghosts where he has to choose which one he's going to be a slave for. It's absolutely horrible. And over time, he learns the language of the dead, he learns the customs of the dead, and he learns to blend in with the dead. It's really quite awful, but it's a survival thing to the point where, in the end, he's got this juju magic that he uses to escape. So he's become quite a powerful character.
Even now, as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking of the first time I came to England at like 14, 15. And having to navigate this new space. I've never been abroad in my lifetime. And kind of my dad like, okay, you guys should go live with your mom because, I have all these issues. So going to England would be a better position for you guys because my mom was a British citizen. So we got citizenship through her. I say to people, my first encounter with being a black person was like coming to England because, in Nigeria, you're either Yoruba or you're Igbo or whatever tribe you're from. So, coming to England and being like, okay, I guess I'm a black person. In Nigeria, I understood, okay, yeah, there is this idea of this thing, racism, but then I didn't understand the depths of how that kind of encompassed how Africans are viewed and all these things. And in England, that's when I start to kind of really recognize and see like, oh, wow, this is a really big issue. And something that, in terms of even colonial history, because we learn colonial history in Nigeria, but then it's told from a point of like, the English came and they civilized us and they made Nigeria better. And you almost kind of learn the opposite when you come to England. So for me, they're kind of parallels between my kind of just life journey and him going into this bush of ghosts. And obviously not to the point of me but being like subjugated by people, but, in terms of encountering these different types of people and, trying to gauge and understand all kinds of people. Whereas before I'd mostly see Nigerians, you'd maybe see the odd foreigner here and there in Lagos. But, here you're encountering so many different cultures, many different types of people.
And when you're that age, you're such an alien to your own body and your own self and your own identity. So it's a really freaky age to have moved. I mean, what was it like in terms of feeling, alien, a foreigner? I certainly felt like that when I moved here, and I'm white and English is my first language. And I'm still getting used to so many things about the country.
It's crazy. One of my earliest experiences, I remember I was going to college on the train, and I, saw this older white man sitting in the carriage, and I said, I'll go sit next to him, but then he grabs his bag, he just holds onto his bag, and then I was like, why is he acting like that? But then I couldn't really understand the reason why he would do that, because I'm just like, I'm just like a young kid, so, I'm not going to do anything. But I remember going back home and asking my mum, and she was like, yeah, like, obviously, you just have to be careful, people like that. This is England. And I know she didn't want to say, like, oh yeah, people are racist or racism, but I could understand what she was saying, like, we're different and people might not be, inclined to be that friendly to you or whatever. So it's like little moments like that where you start to recognize, okay, I am viewed differently, or people might see me differently, or like walking into certain spaces and feeling like you shouldn't be there. But then I guess, it's the diaspora kind of experience. You start to learn to assimilate as the young boy starts to assimilate into the bush of goats and learns the language and learns the customs and traditions.
He has this sort of physical exposure not only to this environment, but also the meticulous detail of skin.
Yeah.
His skin is burnt, it's torn. There's these ghosts that rub his skin and their hands like sandpaper.
Yeah. He's almost kind of used as a sacrifice. They turn him into this kind of massive effigy, then his head swells up.
Yeah, to the size of an elephant. And then they bash his head.
Yeah, then they bash his head, so it's...
He always seems to be on the verge of being killed. He's buried alive, he's beaten repeatedly with clubs. It's kind of preempted in a way right at the beginning of the novel, where the boy is recalling or describing where he lives, saying there were many kinds of African wars, and some of them are as follows. General wars, tribal wars, burglary wars, and the slave wars, which were very common in every town and village. These slave wars were causing dead luck to both old and young of those days, because obviously people were taken off to other countries, nobody knew what happened to them, and they either worked or they were killed, and nobody knew that. And so this awful violence just continues at every level through his culture. And he is enslaved in the beginning in different ways, not just through those different ghosts, but also at some point he's turned into a horse in the beginning.
Yeah, he's turned into a horse, then he's turned into a cow.
And he's used day and night.
Yeah.
Because he's lent out to different
ghosts.
People. I keep saying people, you're right, ghosts. And the writing is really beautiful. He can't eat the leaves that they give him because he's not really a horse. And then through some circumstance, he gets turned into a cow. Yeah. So he goes and lives with the cows, but he can't really eat the grass because he's not actually a cow.
I feel like throughout the story, he's on the edge of death. In many ways, he becomes a ghost himself. Because almost, he's not eating, he's not able to drink, so he's almost dead in a sense. So it's really interesting how Tutuola is making these parallels of this physical body going into this kind of non-physical ethereal space that's between heaven and earth. And there's a lot of metamorphoses throughout the whole story. There's constant transformations from one state to another. And I guess, even kind of thinking, Tutuola describes these different types of wars within Nigeria at the time. And I can imagine these are things he might have seen growing up himself, because he was a lot older when he'd written this book. So, I'm thinking Nigerian in the 30s, early 1920s, this is coming off the back of, things like the Great Benin Expedition and all that kind of stuff, and all these different colonial wars. So, and then I can imagine through oral history, he's also getting accounts of some of these things that would have happened from his parents, family members. So it's interesting how he starts to infuse all of those ideas into the book in almost these different villages. Because some of the ghosts, like the burglar ghosts, supply goods to the other ghosts because they steal earthly stuff from the mothers. And then you have the homeless ghosts who live in a homeless town, and then smelling ghosts, which are all smelling. And for me, in a way, that's also an account of kind of tribalism in Africa. Maybe, these different towns or these different tribes having the contention with each other, or maybe they have certain relationships with each other. Yeah, he's using the idea of these ghosts in these towns to maybe talk about some of his experiences in Nigeria at the time.
So do you want to explain a little bit more about that tribal metaphor? Because there's lots of different languages in Nigeria, lots of different cultures. And you come from a particular culture that's known for their artisans, is that right?
Yeah, so my family, we're from Sabongida Ora, which is like a town in Edo Edo state. My granddad would tell me about like Benin bronzes when I was a kid, and then obviously coming to England, I'm like, oh wow, okay, these Benin bronzes are seen as like these crazy, interesting artifacts here in Europe. For me, it was just, oh yeah, Benin bronzes, that's kind of part of family history and lineage, and because my great granddad was like a chieftain, part of the royal family in Sabongida Ora, so there's this connection to that aspect of it. And my granddad would tell me about the Benin Empire, and so it's interesting for me to find out later, oh okay, the Benin bronzes, and even in how they were using metals at the time, which you didn't really find in many other places, and the aesthetic quality of some of these bronzes and how developed they were. And then I guess lineage wise, it makes sense for me to go into the arts because of where I'm from.
Yeah, because my understanding is the Benin Empire was destroyed by the British in the late 1800s. So the author would have been much closer to that time. That would have been a really potent part of his family history.
Yeah.
And as recently as the mid-1970s, actually, the Nigerian government asked the British Museum, hey, that stuff you stole?
Can you return?
Do you mind? Can we borrow it? To which they said no.
Yeah. It's been an ongoing conversation for like decades now. It's been for a long time. And that it's really interesting because off that expedition that happened, many of these bronzes go to many other countries. They go to France, they go to Germany, they go to so many places. So it's interesting when we think of the legacy of African art in terms of things like modernism, because you had people like Picasso or Giacometti going to all these museums and seeing like, oh, Africans are doing things in a slightly different way. Maybe we should step away from realism and this pursuit of, idealistic human perfection and move into this maybe more symbolic kind of representation of the human body and the figure. Maybe if Europeans didn't see these artifacts, they'd still be trying to make hyper-realistic images and pure perspective. You look at people like Giotto pioneering ideas around perspective and all that kind of stuff. And so it's very, very interesting when you think about, off the back of something like that expedition, how that then transports itself, comes into Europe and then galvanizes, a whole new generation of artists to develop cubism, modernism, abstraction, all these things. So I think that's something that within the arts isn't really spoken about, because I think a large part of contemporary art or modernism as we know today owes a big debt to Africa, and I think that's a conversation that needs to happen a bit more, and maybe they should return these artifacts. I think it's an interesting one because I love going to the British Museum and I could see these things there, but then for me it's a double-edged thing, because I feel like yes, they should return them, but then for people who are here, especially like diaspora, like Nigerians who are here in this country, you won't be able to see that until you go back home. So it makes sense. Yes, they should return them or have some sort of exchange program. Okay, it's in Nigeria for 10 years and then it comes back to Europe, just like they do with museum collections all the time. Going back to this idea of like tribalism in Africa, you have so many different tribes. You have over 50 languages in Nigeria alone. But then through colonialism, you just mishmash everybody in together and you call it Nigeria, which is quite funny because that was named by Henry Lugard, Lord Lugard, who's this colonial regent sent by the British to oversee that region of West Africa. His girlfriend, she comes up with the name Nigeria.
Oh, really? I had no idea. What's she talking about?
It's a really kind of like derogatory term, N-word area. I know there's been like petitions in Nigeria for people who've said like we should change that name, that we shouldn't be referring to ourselves as Nigerians because that's a really derogatory term in terms of referring to people in that region. So if we talk about tribalism in Africa or in Nigeria in general, you're putting all these different tribes who have different customs, different traditions together. And that's what led to things like the Biafra War, the North and South divide within Nigeria. So even today, you still have, recently I've seen it, and people in the kind of Igbo region, the Biafrans, they want to separate from Nigeria to become their own state, their own country. Still, even till today, it's still causing many issues because, these people have been put together by force and, labeled as this. Because obviously during the colonial rush, you have France, England, the UK, all these countries dividing up Africa and saying this is my section, that's my section. That then displaces so many people and causes so much conflict in terms of identity, tradition. Even now, we still see the effects of colonialism. Well, it hasn't really been that long. My dad was born in 56. We got our independence in 1960. My dad's still alive. So I'm only just like second generation out of Nigeria having its independence. And, it's not a long time.
No, it's absolutely nothing. I mean, we can see that in the Middle East. We can see that with the Irish. And yet, I don't know, in a weird way, it's a bit like the British Museum. I love the British Museum. It's one of my favourite places. It really ruptures this idea of there being one way of thinking, one way of being, one cultural practice. And I love London. I love living in London, the melting pot of all these different cultures. And you think, without colonialism, you probably wouldn't have had that. But my God, what a horrible price.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like even with the British Museum, I do have problems with their curation. I think it could be curated a lot better. Because I feel like, yes, they have all these different sections of cultures, but with the kind of work I'm making where I'm looking at commonalities between cultures in terms of, you find archetypal images in Mesoamerican, you find the similar archetypal images in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. So that kind of connection between things, because I feel even with the way the museum's curated, things still feel quite separate. And there's hierarchies. I mean, Africa is in the basement, Europe's upstairs. And then Egypt is separated from Africa intentionally, which I find very problematic because there's this kind of almost whitewashing of Egypt, specifically that region. It's like, it's not really the same as Western Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, as they call it. While I was at the drawing school, I was doing a British Museum course. I did it 2 terms in a row because I just enjoyed going to the British Museum.
I did read that about you. That's dedication for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because it goes, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist. So
okay. That makes sense.
I feel I'm kind of doing a form of visual archaeology by kind of looking at these ancient artifacts, going to places like the British Museum, trying to understand these things. But I'd love to do a residency at the British Museum and maybe curate a show, because there's certain kind of attractions that bring in that footfall for them. So the collection doesn't really change that much, because I've had tutors at a drawing school where I've had conversations with, and these rooms have been the same since the 80s. If they want to start to address some of that legacy of how these things were gotten, or maybe even creating that connection between things, maybe they should give me a residency and I could go in there and help them curate.
Run the place by the sounds of things. But also, I never made that connection about Egypt, so I feel a bit guilty about that. But that's what these conversations are for.
Yeah.
In fact, I came across a philosopher quite recently who's still alive, Simon Blackburn, and he is talking about real philosophy being in discussion and not in books. And I think these sort of conversations and the conversations that you have with Dexter on your own podcast, and we'll talk about that in a moment, they are this sort of breaking up of this, narrow narratives that have one way of looking at things. So, for instance, I understand, how do you say that Yoruba people?
Yeah, Yoruba.
Yeah. Yoruba people did come from the Nile region, didn't they? They come from Egypt.
Yeah, it's really interesting, I feel like, because even with the Yoruba, they talk about accounts of them coming down from the north into the West Africa.
Yeah.
And even when you look at certain symbols, you can see how some of these visual systems trickle down from Egypt into different parts of West Africa. Even with the Akan people in Ghana as well, you find similar symbols. Maybe the British Museum should look into that and make those connections, because I find it ridiculous that we have all these Egyptian artifacts at the ground floor, all lauded and they're amazing, and then next to the Sumerian artifacts, but then you have the Africa section in the basement, almost kind of hidden away. Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with it. I love going there, but then I also know how problematic it is as well. Yeah, like I said, if they give me a residency, I can help them out.
Make some rearrangements by the sounds of things. Coming back to the book, there's something that I didn't understand, which was that I was trying to read it like Aesop's fables and stuff like that, where there was a clear message for each thing that happened.
Yeah.
Whereas this, I was looking for what's the reason why he turned into a cow, why specifically a cow, etc. And I had to let go of that and just go with the flow. Was that your experience of
Yeah, that was definitely. When I was a kid, I used to get told these different kind of folk tales by my granddad. And we used to have this show in Nigeria. It was called Tales by Moonlight. You have different folk tales. And a lot of the times they wouldn't really have a kind of clear cut, good and bad. Sometimes they did, you'd have themes like that. Okay, if you do this or if you don't treat your neighbor right. But I feel like the book almost becomes quite Jungian for me because, when we're looking at these ideas of the anima, the animus, psychology itself, is contentious. There is no clear-cut line of, okay, this is good, this is bad. As the child is kind of constantly reevaluating. Okay, he goes to the burglar ghosts. The burglar ghosts, they bring him into the home and they treat him nice, they give him food, but then he then finds out they're getting all these riches from being in the wombs of women and stealing all their resources, coming back to the burglar town and then selling it off. So there's this constant kind of reevaluation of what good and bad is. And I think that's kind of what Tutuola is almost trying to tell us with this book, that there aren't necessarily clear-cut lines, because also he could have written this book in Yoruba, right? But then he's also using the language of the colonizer to write this book.
Yeah, because it's not a translation. No. He's written it in English.
He's written it in English, So it's really interesting that he then decides to use English as a vehicle. And he brings in little systems like the television and all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting...
a television ghost.
Yeah, a television ghost with television hands, a television head. The lines are blurred, because even when we talk about the slave wars and tribal wars, yes, you had colonialism, but then you also had all these other wars behind that, where you'd have other Nigerians and Africans fighting each other. So there aren't clear-cut lines in the book. I mean, there are points where it's like, okay, yes, these ghosts, when he goes to the church.
When he gets married the first time.
Yeah, when he gets married. And
literally a baptism of fire.
A baptism of fire. And then you have the point in the book where he talks about Mr. Evil's his best man, and he's been stuck on Earth because he was so bad, they sent him away from...
He got kicked out of hell.
He got kicked out of
hell. Super bad,
put in the bush of ghosts, and he's like evil walking, evil joking, evil laughing.
And he also starts with pretty basic ideas that we've talked about already, but then it gets more and more sophisticated as he ages.
Yeah.
Because he's in the Bush of Ghosts for, 24 years?
Yeah, 24 years.
And by this time he's gone through 2 marriages. He's got a kid. So by the end, this is where Christianity comes into play, doesn't it? Because his cousins died.
Yeah.
And he's started this Christian town. And so he's saying to the boy, who never is named.
Yeah, he's never named,
So he meets his cousin, and his cousin's very welcoming, and he trains him, educates him in all these ghostly ways. And then says, stay here with us until you're actually dead.
Yeah.
And then you can be an official ghost in the Bush of Ghosts. And that's quite a tricky thing, isn't it? Because he is in a really good position there. He's really well looked after.
Yeah.
What did you think of the idea that he ends up in this Christian town?
I was just thinking about when we were talking about this idea of the boy being nameless. I feel like the fact that the boy is nameless really puts you inside of him as the protagonist. You become the protagonist as you're reading. It makes me think of things like video games, because a lot of the times in video games you create a character, you have a nameless protagonist that you have to name, because that's a vehicle for you to experience this world. So it's really interesting what he's doing in terms of having this nameless protagonist. Is quite forward thinking. But then I feel like it's this kind of contention between traditional beliefs and Christianity, and I've seen that in my family personally, where my grandma should say things like, oh, don't whistle at night because you call spirits and stuff like that, but then she'd be like, oh, just talk about church or Jesus, like we need to go to church on Sunday. So I think even now, 60 years on, people still trying to formulate this new identity of, okay, we've been affected by these things. It's now a part of who we are. How do we start to navigate and find a new identity almost in a way? Because a lot of what Tutuola would be saying, juju and all these different things, would have been demonized by the church, But then you still have Africans or Nigerians holding on to that legacy, and maybe people are blending. And we see that in many different places, even diaspora-wise. If you go to places like Cuba, where they have Ifa gods from like the Ifa pantheon, like the Yoruba pantheon, because you had a lot of West Africans from Nigeria go to places like Cuba. So you have like the Lukumi system, which is this spiritual system based on using Ifa gods and goddesses and pairing them with certain saints.
Oh, wow. Because they went to Cuba a lot earlier than coming to the UK.
Yeah.
it was a first wave, wasn't
it?
it?
Yeah. So you have like places like Cuba, Brazil. So you which is really interesting. You find a lot of combining belief systems together to create this new system. And I feel like with Tutuola's book, he's combining these two systems together to create a new way of looking at things, or a new language in a sense.
That would actually be a perfect time to manoeuvre towards your work. But I did want to ask just quickly, what did you think of the end? Just to say, so he gets out of the bush of ghosts through all sorts of manipulations and trickery and all that sort of stuff. And then he says, which is so heartbreaking because he's caught straight away and enslaved. And he says, "This is a great pity that I was lost in the bush of ghosts for 24 years with punishments. And when I came out of it, I am caught and sold again as a slave. And now a rich man buys me and he is going to kill me for his God." Anyway, the rich man turns out to be his brother, but it's like life is just happening to you and you have no control over anything.
Yeah.
And okay, he gets to survive because the rich man ends up being his brother, but still it's a pretty shitty system. And then in the end of it, he has these dreams of the celebration of the secret society of ghosts, which happens once a century. And then he says the last line of the book, spoiler, is "This is what hatred did." And I couldn't understand what he meant by that line. What did you make?
And for me, it's interesting because I guess even in the beginning where he talks about, the hatred of his stepmother, of not informing him and his brother.
Yeah, that's true.
The slavers will come in. Really?
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in here and say that what we're talking about here is that there are 3 wives, and 2 of the wives only have daughters.
Yeah.
And the boy, his mother, has 2 sons, so she is, let's say, valued more.
Yeah, more.
And she's off at the marketplace trading when the slavers come in, and the other 2 wives escape and leave the boys to their own devices.
Yeah. Because there's this whole contention because, this is a thing that happens. Like my granddad had 2 wives, 12 kids. So even just in my own family history, from the first line of the book, I'm like, yeah, I definitely know what he's talking about in terms of, yes, there will be hierarchies. It's kind of crazy because in Nigeria, you're allowed to have as many wives as you want. My grandma lived in the main house with my grandfather, and then his other wife lived behind the house with her children. They didn't feel like they were as important as my grandmother's kids. And even when my granddad died, it was a big thing because the will comes in and land and all these things. So there's a lot of contention. So I can understand how this idea of where he talks about hatred and how that propagates it. So it's a weird one because you do have families where, that system might work, but it's not always the case.
It's also surely about laws coming in terms of ownership and land ownership.
Yeah.
And that's where you get this huge divide, for instance, between genders.
Yeah. The man is the head of the household and he controls everything and the finances and this what's done, makes the major decisions and all that kind of stuff. So even in terms of agency for women and what they're allowed to do and how valid or important they are if you don't have a son then. Yeah. So it's interesting because I think Tutuola, maybe that's something he might have also experienced himself. But it's interesting in terms of the journey. Yeah, I mean, it is quite a kind of sad thing in terms of, this is what hatred has done. But then I also think, this for me where it comes into that more kind of Jungian thing of like, you're always constantly kind of maybe battling against something or you have this thing crop up and arise. And Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey and how throughout the hero's journey you go through all these different trials and tribulations.
Who's Joseph Campbell?
So Joseph Campbell he's a writer, kind of like a philosopher, and he was writing a lot of books based on mythology. He's got a really famous book called Hero with 1,000 Faces, where he looks at the hero myth in different cultures and finds parallels between them. It's got a series on Netflix, I think, called The Power of Myth, which is really good.
Oh, brilliant.
So he's someone who kind of talks about this idea of the hero's journey quite a lot, because he was also kind of like a student of Carl Jung, and he's took those ideas into focus on mythology and how we can use myths to enhance our lives.
Who'd have thought when your dad bought you those comic books that this is the path that he would set up for you?
Yeah, I know.
So I want to move on to your work. What becomes quite apparent in the book is this very unclear distinguishing between alive and dead. I mean, at one point, he says at the very beginning, the ghosts were so old and weary that it is hard to believe they were actually living creatures. And they're not living because they're dead. Like, it's an oxymoron. I think we get the same sense in your work, not necessarily alive and dead, but real and unreal, I suppose. And just to say that you create figurative drawing works. You're primarily a draftsman and you work in watercolour and oil centred around mythology, customs, family, heritage and scenic framings of life in the mind. And I didn't read that about you, this life in the mind, but I feel that that's very much where the work is.
Yeah, definitely. Like, you know, a lot of the work is coming kind of from the abstract psychological space in the mind, this space between heaven and earth, like, you know, like he says in the book, where this non-physical space. I've used this term like future past before in terms of, okay, maybe the work existing in its potential future, but then also referencing the ancient past as well. So it's interesting for me, the work does exist in this quite abstract space. There's reference to the physical world, but then, you know, a lot of it is still kind of intangible. So yeah, it is in a way kind of like the Bush of Ghosts, you know, you go in there, so how do I say it? You can make out certain things, but things are still fleeting.
Yeah, I find them really liquid. I think there's this sort of liquidity and convergence, and that's what I mean by this mind, you know, where the mind and body converge. And you've got all these objects which look like they've got liquid surfaces and people who look like they've got liquid skin. So there's this shape-shifting potential that goes on. In fact, I do think a lot of, I don't know if you've ever seen Spirited Away.
Yeah.
So No Face, who is solid and then he becomes liquid. And then he is a character within a character, so a character comes out of No Face. You don't know what the hell's going on. And there's a bit like that in your work, and I'm sitting here in your studio and I'm looking at these two amazing pieces of work on the wall where I can see that you've got these sculptures depicted. There's a ram's head or something, and then a little sculptural
like
character,
dwarf effigy.
Yeah, and then what I think of as a person, maybe dreaming about these things, but they're all depicted in their surfaces in such a similar way that they all feel equal to me.
Yeah, I think, because for me, the figure is not necessarily like a figure in terms of, okay, I'm drawing an actual person. The figure is more like symbolic or a representation of, you know, an aspect of my mind or my psyche. So, yeah, in terms of the clear-cut distinction, because, you know, when you try and look in your mind's eye, you know, you get images popping in and out. Things aren't necessarily clearly defined. So I think that quality of them being liquid and also kind of like, you know, in my life in the Bush of Ghosts, where the boy is going through this constant metamorphoses. You know, like you were saying as well, the quality of the figures also feeling like they might change or they might shift or they might transform themselves at any time. And even when we look at ourselves through life, when you're 10, you're a different individual to when you're 30, when you're 40, when you're 50. And this goes back to ideas of people like Carl Jung or Joseph Campbell, where we all go through our own individual journey of metamorphoses and change through life. And also I'm a water sign as well, so it kind of makes, makes sense for me to use water in that way. With watercolors. So even for the viewer, it allows the viewer to also project onto the figures in terms of how they might try and piece them together. Because when I draw with, okay, maybe pen and ink, things slightly change and maybe things are defined in a certain way. But with watercolors, in terms of the engagement with the viewer and how I can allow the viewer to kind of also project and interact and kind of put their own kind of inclinations or understandings on the figure, it opens the work up a bit more, you know.
And you have these borders around them. I'm just realising now, I suppose, almost like a comic book. So I do get the sense that they're sort of scenes of a bigger story. And do you think of them as stories? I mean, there's something about some of them that feel very staged, for instance, and I'm thinking in particular, and I'm going to say this wrong, of Awan. Sarah. Which the translation would be the actors? Yeah,
even like the artist.
Artist, okay.
So that was quite, that is quite like a stage thing, because I was thinking about this idea of some sort of like atelier or studio of people making things, creating these different symbols or systems or visual effigies that maybe people could access. But I feel like, yeah, definitely, I feel all the works are part of this kind of idea of me trying to create my own personal microcosm as a reflection of the larger macrocosm people could delve into and, yeah, interact with. So, yeah, definitely, in my head, they're part of this bigger narrative that I'm still formulating as to what it is and how clearly defined it is. But, yeah,
you'll probably
definitely
work that out. You'll probably work everything out by the time you're on your deathbed.
So, yeah, pretty much.
Take your time. So this microcosm, this bigger sort of cosmos that you are referring to, you're a bit of a sci-fi geek.
Yeah, I love, I love sci-fi and a lot of sci-fi themes and physics. And I'm really interested in this idea of like multiverses, because maybe this is me being a bit crazy, but in some ways, maybe the work I'm making is interfacing with these alternate realities or these multiversal spaces. Because in physics, they talk about this idea of, we have all these different realities stacked up against each other in these different universes. You have different versions of the reality we live in today. So when you look into things like visionary experiences or psychics or kind of like shamanistic systems, they talk about interfacing all these alternate spaces, these non-physical spaces. So in a way, I guess Carl Jung talks about this idea of artists being able to pull from the collective unconscious and kind of filtering down all these abstract or ethereal things into a physical form for us to be able to engage with and understand. That's why he talks about this idea of archetypes persisting over decades, because they are this kind of universal thing that can exist between different time periods. And so in some ways, I feel like, the work is kind of doing that and me trying to make the intangible tangible in some form.
In doing that, you also get that mix-up. For instance, contemplating with effigies, you get a character and masks. So masks depict characters, and I don't know about that one, but in other works of yours, you get shadows of characters or characters that look like they're not entirely human, but everything feels on the same level and the same amount of aliveness or not aliveness. In fact, it was you do a podcast called the Compendium Podcast, and I've only just started it with Dexter Orsak.
Yeah.
And in the episode I was listening to, it really, really is a good podcast. I do recommend it. Second to mine, obviously. But in that, he's talking about drawing and sort of coming back to basics with your practice. And the idea of looking at something from the outside and imagining the inside. And when he's talking about it and when you're talking about it with him, it did make me think a lot about drawing and a lot about drawing and its connection to sculpture, which you've delved into. But also, I mean, there are differences, obviously, but almost there's no difference in a way between that sort of inquisition into the inside of something. Be that a mask or a sculpture or a person. Yeah,
definitely. I think, because for me, the body itself becomes another symbol, another visual device to kind of play with. When I was at the drawing school, when you go to places like the National Gallery, you see these hierarchies between how maybe the body might be described compared to other elements in the picture and the importance is on the figure. For me, it's interesting because I'm also, interested in this idea of, us looking at some of these older visual motifs and the importance of them and how these symbols persist. So kind of dispelling some of these hierarchies through the painting kind of brings everything at the same level. Looking at that commonality, things start to work on similar levels. There are common elements between this and between that. And the body itself becomes its own kind of collection of motifs and symbols. The heart, the lungs. In ancient Greece, they'd make a lot of effigies based around different parts of the body. So you'd have all these different cults where they'd make, effigy of the hand and it has all these symbols, or an effigy of the heart. And that would be associated with healing and all these different kinds of things. I'm interested in things like that where the body itself or the figure itself becomes a motif, and it's almost kind of like I'm sculpting the figure again. If I'm looking at a sculpture and then I put a figure in it, they all kind of interact together in this similar kind of fashion, and they become part of this kind of rotating thing where, the little dwarf effigy holding up the figure. There's a relationship between them, because I don't want the objects to just be like a memento mori. I don't want it to be like, it's just me populating the image with objects, but the objects and the figure and everything, they're all kind of working in tandem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's more than just the figures and the objects. It's things like the rock.
Yeah,
There's as much detail with the rock and the landscape, and there are similarities between the way a mountain might be depicted and the character's skin.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the part of the work to me that also connects with your, or perhaps connects with, or I'm imagining connects with your original training in textiles. That every surface is patterned.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm a big pattern fan, so...
Yeah, I feel, definitely, because when I did my textiles degree, I was working on things that more like tapestries, printed textiles, various cultures, but I wasn't really thinking about things in terms of like figuration. I wasn't thinking like a fine artist, but it was then going to the drawing school and almost kind of reinventing my practice. And I started painting with watercolors. I realized, because I specialized in print design, so I was working with a lot of screen printing, so you're working with several layers building up an image. And then I realized how I use watercolors, and it's quite similar to how you would screen print an image, where you work with a lighter layer and then you start to build things up. So that kind of methodology or the thinking with textiles is definitely in the way I paint, in terms of, working with a medium like watercolors and working from this really light layer, or even using like the white of the paper and thinking about color, pattern. A lot of textile kind of sensibilities are in the paintings themselves. And even how I draw, sometimes I realize I work in almost kind of like patterns, especially when I draw with pen and ink, because I'm really into like almost working in a quite traditional way, like, cross-hatching, and that becomes a little pattern itself. I don't really think about my textiles practice, but then I feel like it's all just kind of transformed itself into relating to what I'm doing now, fine art now. Eventually, I would like to go back to doing more textile stuff, but yeah, we'll see how it goes.
And what took you to textiles in the first place? Because where I live, I'm quite near a market that sells lots and lots of African textiles. And so I've ended up picking up a lot of them just out of slightly being starved for colour living in this country, because all the colours are very subdued. Yeah. So is that something from your cultural history? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I remember like being a young kid, so you get what is called Iran buba.
A
gown.
Yeah.
You kind of like a gown, like, so you get a long sleeve shirt, you get trousers, and you sometimes get a little cap. I never used to like wearing the hats because I just thought they were cheesy, but I remember being a young kid and my mom or my grandma would buy like fabric and they'd be like, okay, we're going to make a Iran buba for you because you have to wear this, and it's part of our history and tradition.
Sorry, what's it called?
Iran and buba.
Okay.
Yeah. Me and my brother, we'd have those sewn for us. And then when I came to England, I ended up doing my A-levels and then did textiles. And I found that I had a really kind of affinity with textiles, natural affinity. I remember my textiles tutor just like, like maybe you should do textiles, because I was doing a lot of stuff in college with like batik, like dyeing fabric and all that. And obviously when you look at Nigeria, you have like the history of like dye pits and all that stuff in the north. For me, this goes back to this idea of almost kind of like genetic or ancestral kind of information. For me, there were certain inclinations for certain types of art forms or processes which just came naturally. Now, as I've gotten older, I'm realizing, it makes sense that I would want to make work in this way because of where I'm from. And so there's a really interesting connection lineage wise. When I was in CSM, I was really interested in printing. So I was working on like 4 meter, 2 meter length tapestries for my final major project.
Central St. Martin's.
Yeah, Central St. Martin's. So I was really interested in this idea of producing these massive textiles, and textiles functioning like a visual motifs or narratives rather than just being for decoration. Because what I found when I was at my course was like, we're making textiles for home, textiles for fashion. It was always in the service of something else.
Yeah.
But I wanted the textiles itself to become a visual kind of thing we could look at and engage with. So I was really interested in that idea, but then, textile production is so expensive. Because I was working with linen, so I got a sponsorship in my final year from the Cloth Workers Foundation. So I got to go to Belgium and go to linen factories and, see how linen was produced. Went to flax farms, so they gave me loads of linen to print. And also when you look at the history of linen, like linen sacks and all that kind of stuff. So I was really interested in the history of like linen, but then graduating, you don't have any of those resources. I'm just working in retail and I'm like, how can I make this 2 meter length piece that I really want to make? It forced me to kind of reinvent my practice. And also because I was really interested in things like mythology and some of these visual systems, motifs and archetypes, because I read the book Man in His Symbols Symbols by Carl Jung and his students, kind of talking about symbols throughout history in relation to the psyche and in relation to the arts. So I wrote about semiotics for my dissertation at CSM. But then I remember doing that on a textile course. My tutors were a bit like, you should have just gone and done fine art.
Oh, no way. Oh, my gosh.
The way I was thinking about textiles was quite different from what I was being taught on the course. So I was running into a lot of problems. After graduating was my way of, I need to find a medium or processes that would help me make the kind of things I wanted to make. And yeah, like I said, due to like financial limitations, I wasn't able to make textiles in the way I wanted to, which led me to going to the drawing school and becoming more of a fine artist now. But like I said, all those sensibilities, like especially in terms of how I use color, all of that is from textiles. I'd create one screen for different colors. So I'd do, maybe one screen for the red, and then when I print the red on top of the orange, it would turn a different color. I print the blue on top of this. So yeah, in terms of like color sense, that's really come from textiles, because I read Joseph Alber's Interaction of Color.
That's a beautiful book.
Yeah, I love that book so much. In my first year of doing textiles, and I read it again in my second year. And ever since reading that book, it just changed how I saw color, especially in terms of how colors can affect each other. So even when I'm painting with watercolors, in terms of these interactions and color temperature and all these kinds of things. So that came, from textiles and my understanding of color at that time. So yeah, it's all crazy, really.
And it's interesting to listen to you talk just now about when you're doing textiles, the idea is, you really should have done fine art. When you're doing fine art, you really should have done textiles. And then you're talking about, you'd almost draw a line with your family history between Nigeria and the UK in a funny way. So your heart is essentially, in both those practices. Yeah. And what about your sense of your own identity? Are you a Nigerian living in London?
Yeah, a lot of the times I feel like I'm a Nigerian living in London, because even in terms of certain aspects of British culture, I feel like I'm still kind of assimilating certain things, but I feel like for me right now, it's starting to feel a bit more like, okay, yeah, I could term myself as a British Nigerian, because people say, oh, you're like British Nigerian. I'm like, no, I'm not. I just say that I'm just Nigerian. Yeah, yes, I have a British passport. I just consider myself a Nigerian, but I feel like as I get older, even with like my current relationship, I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess I'm starting to become more this kind of dual identity. But then I think when I think of British culture, I'm thinking maybe more in terms of like Black British culture as opposed to like white English culture. Not someone who'd go and sit in a pub or certain aspects
of the white British people.
Yeah, I'm not really. I know that's not what they all do, but but yeah, maybe in terms of more Black British culture and this kind of diasporic experience of living in a different place, but then also going to places like the British Museum or some institution like the Royal Drawing School, and then being introduced to things like the National Gallery, because I'd never been to the National Gallery. I'd been there like once or twice, but I didn't really see, the importance of something like the National Gallery and why all these old masters were cool and all that kind of stuff. So even for me, in terms of visual language, going to somewhere like the British Museum and the National Gallery has really affected how I create images, because a lot of these compositional ideas are things I kind of learned while I was going to the National Gallery and looking, okay, how do you work with a composition or bordering or working in a triptych, diptych, or different sort of visual systems? How do you lead the viewer's eye in an image? So a lot of these ideas I've learned from European artists. So when I'm making work now, there's this blend. Like here, I've got a book of El Greco over there, and that's like one of my favorite European painters, because I think he's just like amazing, in terms of this visionary experience. And I remember during my year at the drawing year, I focused on William Blake a lot. He's interested in this personal mythology and then this non-physical space. So in terms of identity, I would still regard myself as a Nigerian living in England, but I feel like with the work, there's a blend of both cultures, looking at my personal heritage and my history, and then also my experiences here and all these new things I've been exposed to as a result of going to places like Central St. Martin's and going to the drawing school and then teaching at the drawing school. The work is always psychological, right? So I feel what I'm saying physically is like, I still feel I'm Nigerian, but the work is telling me like, hey, look, you're already blending these two different cultures together.
Yeah, so it's very much opened up a lot of your ideas and introduced all sorts of new ways of thinking and looking for you, as much as it's exposed all sorts of contradictions and hierarchies that, are obviously extremely problematic. And the Royal Drawing School is very much part of who you are at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, but that's quite doing so much there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you're teaching there.
Yeah, teaching at the moment.
On the board or something?
Yeah, I'm a faculty member and on the academic board, so I've been helping with curriculum planning and introducing sort of like new courses and all that kind of stuff.
So what's your particular contribution do you feel that you are making or you have made?
So I mean, currently I did 2 courses which I helped to kind of come up with. One's mythology and art and the other's world imagery. Okay. So mythology and art, it's right in the name. We're looking at mythology and looking at art practice and how some of these mythological themes are used in art, and also how mythological themes have informed some of these visual systems in other cultures. And then we're also in world imagery, we're looking at visual cultures across the world, looking at these commonalities between them or how certain ideas develop into other ideas. So the previous week we looked at sequential narratives. So we're looking at this idea of working in a sequence. So we looked at things like cylinder seals made in Sumeria. So where, you have a cylinder seal made out of a precious stone. So it's a little circular stone which you roll out into a piece of wet clay, but it creates like a kind of sequence in terms of one thing follows on from the other. And then we were looking at things like woodblock prints in Japan, like ukiyo-e prints, and the limitations of woodblock printing because they wouldn't be able to create a long singular panel. So you'd have to work in a almost kind of like panel system. And then we look at how that then becomes things like comics or storyboarding in films. I can then introduce some of these ideas I'm interested in and then also new things into an institution like the drawing school. And that opens up the language, because one thing I thought when I went there was like, there's so much of a focus on European conventions in image making. Now I've introduced, mythology and art, world imagery. We can look at some of these conventions outside of Europe, but then still bring it back in like, hey, look, there are relationships between what some of these European artists are doing and what we're doing in other countries, Africa, Asia. One of the world imagery courses, we looked at costumes and dress and fabric in various cultures. So we were looking, there's this Wilderman festival in parts of Europe where people dress up as kind of like animal skins, and looking at the purpose of why would we dress up in ritualistic dress. And then we looked at different festivals and ritual systems across the world. So I was saying to students, we're all different people and all come from different places, but we all have this tradition of wanting to dress up with a mask and fabrics that adorn the body and changes the figure, and then you represent this deity or this nature spirit. It's an idea that persists no matter where you're from.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I mean, after we do this recording, part of me is going to go and sign up for that at the Royal Drawing School. That doesn't even sound like something a place like the Royal Drawing School would even do. Because I started with drawing. That was always my weird, isolated kid obsession. But I eventually started looking at what is regarded as a great drawing and thought, I can't relate to this sort of way of drawing. It wasn't really until I had kids and started watching all these Japanese anime that I thought, now I like drawing again. I've just recently, in the last couple of years, started drawing again for exactly that reason. And when you talk about the drawing school, almost like following this lineage of how things develop and change, and I did speak to you about this earlier, I'm super interested in lineage in my own practice. I think, wow, that sounds completely fascinating. Yeah,
because I think, we lose, like I was saying, the debt of Europe in terms of modernism and how all these African artifacts influenced the whole new generation of European artists who then went on to do Cubism, Surrealism, all these different things, and looking at the more symbolic aspect of image making. So I'm not just kind of looking at it of like, drawing from a kind of European tradition. I'm looking at drawing from like petroglyphs and like the Nazca lines, which are different animal motifs across the huge landscape that you can't really see unless you're high up, and mark making, early cave paintings to what we see as drawing today, So I think that idea is something that I kind of, teaching at the drawing school has really opened up, because like you're saying as well, this idea, this is what an accomplished drawing is. Not to say that observation, yes, is still important, and learning some of these fundamentals are important, but kind of looking at drawing as a whole. Every culture has contributed to what we understand as drawing today. We look at our apps on our phone. before you had stone tablets, now you have a glass tablet with all these little logograms inside of it. So a similar kind of idea and methodology, but that's taken from something that's quite ancient. Or even things like emojis, emojis and
that's what I was thinking.
Similar concepts and similar ideas. So that's why even this idea of future past is interesting for me, because the past is always informing the future. I think just in general, we shouldn't kind of look at the past as being primitive in quotation marks, because there are certain systems in the past which are more advanced than what we have today. Pyramids, for example, we still can't build them. We still don't know the technology behind how they would pull these large boulders and stones across miles and create these massive megalithic structures. So yeah, I think, in many ways through teaching and maybe through the work I'm making, is me trying to like encourage people like, hey, look, there's a lot of really cool stuff in the past, but then also that informs the future we're moving into, like now we have Facebook in this whole metaverse space, which is interesting, because I'm also thinking about the Bush of Ghosts, where you have all these different avatars, or you have all these different beings in different forms. Like you have ghosts with eyes on their knees, these kinds of things. And then you look at this idea of this kind of metaverse space. We're going to be creating these different avatars that look very different to the physical body, so it almost becomes this technological bush of ghosts where you're going to encounter these different avatars, because we are creating more non-physical spaces through digital technology. That creates a whole new idea of how we then relate back to the physical spaces we're in. Yeah, I feel like my mind is in like so many different places at once, and maybe because I'm dyslexic, it's trying to create all these different connections between things. And
and yet then in the work there's this sort of it's not quietly contemplative, but there is such a stillness about the work in terms of sound, not necessarily music as such, but I can't.
It's interesting that you do say sound, because I do think about sometimes, like, can you hear sound in an image? I guess for a lot of the work, there's this kind of meditative quality, or like you said, this stillness of them.
But they're not quiet.
Yeah, they're not quiet.
That's why I'm a bit stuck on what sound is it, because it's almost like a mid-audio sound, like a constancy. So that's the meditative.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, looking into the future and the sort of challenges and possibilities of where you'd like to see your studio practice develop, it sounds like it's very much invested in the Royal Drawing School to me, and what you can open up in that context.
I'm enjoying teaching, but then I also know I want to spend a lot more time in the studio and have time to just make my own work.
Like you did in lockdown.
Yeah, like I did in lockdown. But yeah, it's something I'm still trying to balance out in terms of the kind of relationship between the two, because I feel like teaching definitely feeds my practice, but then, you need just time to kind of go into your own world and do your own thing. In terms of the work, I just want to keep scaling up. I feel like all the figures want to be bigger.
Okay.
So I think for me, I've got a commission next year, which is a mural commission, which will be quite a challenge. So I'm really excited for that, because I feel that's going to just push me. So I think, scaling up right now and just more world building, because I want to go into sculpture as well. Because I did make a few sculptures in my 2019 solo at Zablidovich collection. Maybe bringing back some textiles into it, maybe things that are a bit more like installation-y. In my open studio when I was at the drawing school, I used some of my old textile pieces and created like a little altar with this like purple slab, and then I had the textile underneath, and then had the effigies, which was out of wax. Almost kind of like people coming into the space and acknowledging the effigies and then looking at the work. So yeah, there's a lot more, because I only finished at the drawing school in 2017, so that's been 3 years of me really kind of practicing as a fine artist. So I still feel like I have a long way to go in terms of really developing my practice. I've only just turned 30 and I feel like I haven't really done anything. I've still got a lot to do.
Well, you've certainly got a very, very busy life ahead, and it's really good of you to take up your very precious studio time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I've had a lovely conversation. It's been great.
Good. There's so many more things I do want to know, but I am going to answer some of them by listening to the Compendium podcast, which is on Spotify, and I will also list the books that you've mentioned, and you've got a great collection of books here that you might put together a book list for me, and I'll put it on the podcast notes, as well as the exhibitions that you've got coming up. And for now, Richard Ayodeji Ikhide, thank you very much for talking to me today.
Yes, thank you very much, Jillian. Yeah, it was a great conversation. I had a good time. Yeah, great stuff.
It was good. Are you working today in the studio? Is that the rest
I'll probably be here for a little bit, and I'm going to go home.
Thank you, listeners, and also thanks to the very talented Richard Ayodeji Ikhide. Art Fiction's Culture Exchange is part of the UK-Australia season, which is a partnership between the British Council and the Australian Government's Department of Foreign Affairs. Guests for this series are artistic practitioners whose work is underpinned by geographical shifts, upheavals and reassessments of their cultural identity. The music for this self-produced abridged podcast was written and performed by Jillian Knipe, while award-winning animator Joanna Quinn of Beryl Productions created the Art Fiction's logo. If you'd like to support the series, please subscribe and rate, and you're welcome to get in touch with me directly via my artfictions_podcast Instagram or my website jillianknipe.com. Happy reading and art viewing till next time.